first episode of Mopping the Floor, where we discuss how to clean up the mess that is the United States Congress.
On today's episode, we got to the bottom of whether or not the people feel the government represents them.
To gain more perspective, we talked to Mrs. Harmony Mize, a French-American U.S. history teacher, for her views on the topic. So, you came all the way from France to end up living in the great state of Indiana. Obviously, you like some things about it, so what drew you to Indiana?
Well, what drew me is the college. I will say that's the magnet right there. I think the staying aspect, obviously, I got married, but I do think Indiana has a great sense of community. I think it's something that I particularly enjoy, that we're able to come together as one and, we help our neighbors. I don't know that's the case in every state because I've obviously not lived in every state, but that's one of the great things of Indiana.
And what are your opinions on the Hoosier State's closed primary elections?
I think it's interesting. I'm pretty conflicted about this because I understand the theory behind it, right? Like, it's for your parties, you try to have engagement by either the Democrats or Republicans, right? Well, here are the Republicans, to come and vote for the candidate they wish to have representing them. I think it does disenfranchise others from also, especially in a state where that tends to be red. Maybe others would like to participate, even though they may not agree with the Republican Party. I think some Democrats would like to also, they're like, if I'm going to have a Republican governor, could I please participate in choosing also who that person may be, even though I may not agree, if I'm going to end up with one. You see what I mean? And I think also it's pretty detrimental that if you want to vote in the primary, you have to register with that party. And then if you were to run for office, then you're basically unable to switch your party lines. So let's say you want to vote in the Republican primary, but you're a Democrat, then you can't run as a Democrat because you register with the Republican Party. So I think it actually messes up the political landscape.
Okay, so then question 2, what measures could be taken to increase voter turnout in Fort Wayne, the state of Indiana, and the United States?
Oh, wow. Well, I think voter turnout for the last general election was good. Honestly, I don't know, because if I had the solution, I'd be there fixing it.
The last primary was 15%.
I know, and I think the issue is we're in a constant election cycle, and people feel fairly burnt out. So I know it's going to sound counterintuitive, but I feel like maybe stopping with the campaigning that is continuous, where everyone feels burnt out, people are more likely to go because they feel like, oh, okay, it's election season. All right, let me get interested again. But because it is literally nonstop, people are, I'm not going.
On
I'm
TV.
tired. Yeah, it's on you cannot escape it.
Which country do you feel the general public has more representation, America or France?
I think France does, for 2 reasons. I think because it's a popular vote when it comes to especially the presidency, and not an electoral college vote. So it's really one vote, one count, which therefore it's what the population wanted and not the mismatch of electoral college votes. And I also think the two-party system in the United States is flawed. Because as a voter myself, 90% of the time I'm like, these two parties do not represent my beliefs. So now this is how I feel. This is a personal statement. Hopefully that's recorded. And I'm pretty big on climate change, and I would like to see a Green Party or more action over this, but I'm always stuck with only one party that brings it up as something to fix, right? Fix the climate, trying to combat the climate we're in, but they're not, I wouldn't call them particularly passionate about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's my issue, is we are too many and there are too few choices for us. It's either one or the other, and very rarely do people think black and white like this.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do you think there's any ways that America has a better system than France when it comes to elections?
No.
No. Okay.
The no does not mean it's bad. It's just, no, I don't think so. I think there are quite a few things in the American system that works great. Example, voting by mail, I think is amazing. You can't do that in France. So I think that's great, but I don't think one system is better than the other. I think they're equal in their flaws and their greatness. So.
Okay.
Okay, so as you probably know, Indiana has 10 representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives, 8 Republicans, and 2 Democrats. Do you think these numbers accurately represent the views of all Hoosiers?
I'm not sure. I would say no, because the most populated areas of Indiana are located in Indy and Fort Wayne, and they vote Democrat. And then the mismatch of counties and whatnot makes it so there are a lot of Republican representation. And I don't know that's necessarily a true reflection of the state of Indiana. Yeah.
Do you feel that you are represented in the government on a city, state, and national level?
Not necessarily. As a woman, I don't, especially right now, as a woman, I don't feel like we are being represented accurately and for what we want. As an immigrant, I don't feel like I'm particularly represented either. And I would say that I feel maybe a little bit more represented at the national level than at the state level.
Really?
Yeah. Like, is it for what I am, like as a woman, immigrant, different things. I feel like the national level, not for my state, right?
Yeah.
But looking at the composition of the federal government,
okay.
I feel more represented there than I
see.
do within the state of Indiana.
That makes sense. All right, so this is the last part of the questions. It also has to do with the Electoral College. So you teach both dual credit and AP US History. So you're aware of the founders' intentions for the Electoral College. Do you think the Electoral College is an appropriate way to elect the president today? And can you think of any pros to it rather than cons?
I do think it's flawed. And that's a personal statement again. I do think something has to give. The Electoral College does not seem to be working. The intention, I get it. The application of the Electoral College, I feel like we've entered a moment where we've stretched it so far that it's no longer supposed to be doing what it's doing. I understand that it was, to prevent, especially authoritarian leaders in the end, to gain the presidency, but I don't think it's working. I don't think it would even work if it were to happen. Because we are too entrenched in a two-party system.
Yeah.
I think it's the two-party system preventing the Electoral College to actually work as it's intended. So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Do you have an idea of what we could do instead of the Electoral College?
Popular vote.
Just popular vote.
Popular vote. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
It was great having your perspective on our podcast.
You're welcome. When is this?
What a wonderful interview from Mrs. Mize. I thought her take on closed primaries was very interesting because she gave both positives and negatives.
On the positive, she brought up a point that I hadn't really thought about before about engaging people to vote on each side, but that would be assuming that most people do support a political party, and if they support a political party, then they will be more likely to be engaged.
There's also the negatives of, if your state typically votes one way and you don't agree with that, then if it's a closed primary, you have almost no influence on who actually gets elected. Whereas if it's an open primary, you at least have a little bit of say in who from that party gets the nomination.
Yeah, she gave out the example of, if you want to pick someone from that party because you know that your say on the other side isn't really going to make that much of a difference, you can't with closed primaries, and then you don't really have a say as to who represents you.
Yeah, and it also just gets kind of complicated because every state has like their own system, and some are closed, some are open, some are like weird combinations of them.
Like,
some have like multiple nominations, but it doesn't matter whose party they're from. It's a really complicated system, and I feel like there are definitely better ways it could be done.
Exactly. I mean, imagining moving from one state to another and changing the entire way you're represented. Yeah. In one state, you can vote in a closed primary. In the other, you have open primaries, but you are no longer represented the same you were when you were in another state.
Like, for example, how Alaska has the ranked voting in their primaries.
Yeah, and this is all like very important as well because it's the way we influence our government. I mean, obviously, there's people tend to focus more on the presidential elections because they're big and they're national and they apply to everyone. But local governments have a lot of power too, so these primaries, they really matter a lot for how your life is impacted by the government.
And a lot of people would agree that state and local governments will have more influence on your day-to-day life than the president. And I was looking at this survey from the Congressional Institute that found that less than 40% of middle-class Americans think that they are represented. And I think that connects to the point about, the everyday life, the everyday middle-class family. That makes up a big, big portion of our population. Why or why not are they voting? And why or why not do they feel represented?
And that's a really big deal, because if only 40% of middle-class Americans feel that their vote is truly represented in government, that means 60% don't. And we know that when voters don't feel they're represented, they have low political efficacy, so they're less likely to vote in general. And that means that people who have more extreme opinions and they feel more strongly one way or the other are the ones deciding who actually runs this country.
We also know that demographics affect that number a lot because most of the time, younger voters feel underrepresented by their government because representatives are tailoring to the older population because they have more political efficacy. And if 60% of the middle class population doesn't feel they are represented by the government, then it's very possible in the coming elections that they will be less likely to vote. One of the main reasons many probably feel they are underrepresented is because of the Electoral College's winner-take-all system.
Yeah, exactly. Because with the Electoral College, it would be near impossible for a third party or an independent to get anywhere. Because if, besides for Maine and Nebraska, the most popular party or most popular candidate, which for a lot of people means most popular party, in each state, gets the whole state. They take the whole state when it comes to the electoral votes. Like, if 60% of the electors in a state vote for the Republican candidate and only 40% vote for the Democratic candidate, then the Republican candidate will get all that state's electoral support. So it's a flawed system. It is flawed because it takes away the value of many, many votes across the country.
Yeah, and I feel like that issue it's almost exaggerated in places that have closed primaries as well, because if your state is almost certainly going to elect the party, or the candidate from one specific party, and there's a closed primary, you have very little influence over what happens at all. You can't choose which candidate gets that party's nomination. You can't choose which candidate your state votes for. You just really don't have much power.
Exactly, and the Boston Review says that proportional representation, otherwise known as PR, is based on the principle that any group of like-minded voters should win legislative seats in the proportion to its share of the popular vote, whereas the winner-take-all principle, which is what we have now, awards 100% of the representation to a 50.1% majority. But PR allows voters in a minority to win their fair share of representation. This means that oftentimes members of racial and ethnic minorities are underrepresented, and voters' choices are restricted to candidates within the two-party Republican-Democratic monopoly. This means that most legislative elections are effectively no-choice contests in districts dominated by a single party.
Yeah, and tying that back to the presidential election, I know like a lot of people in the past few elections, and of course the upcoming one, are saying, oh, well, guess we just have to vote for the lesser of two evils, where if there was a more proportional system, or, just the popular vote, they wouldn't have to vote for the lesser of two evils. They could vote for a candidate that they wanted and not have to worry about, someone coming in doing a bad job that's just slightly worse or slightly better than the job the other guy would do. It's just the representation of beliefs across the United States is not reflected by two parties.
Yeah, but I do see at least, sort of the reasoning behind the Electoral College. I don't fully agree with it, obviously, but looking back at the historical context and how, the Founding Fathers decided on it, it was in many ways a compromise that had to be done to even have this country in the first place, and it did have some goals of making sure that larger states didn't just control smaller states without those states having any say in how their government is run or whatever.
But with that being said, the Electoral College was initially created to essentially keep representation away from certain groups of people. Only white rich men were the ones to decide the vote for their state. They chose what happened to all of the women, children, and African Americans and slaves in their state. They were the only ones that had a say, and while it has changed so that everybody is now voting, it still keeps the general same idea.
Well, yes, but even back then, it wasn't all rich white men that voted. It was just some specific ones who had been chosen by their state legislatures, because obviously the Electoral College, it used to be that they didn't really follow the popular vote. In fact, most places didn't even do a popular vote in the first place. The president was originally supposed to be chosen by these group of elites to try and keep to try and make sure that the president was someone who was well qualified and not just some sort of populist who was simply gaining the will of the people, even if they had no actual experience or skills to be able to back that up.
Yes, but also taking into consideration at that time how little of the population was actually literate, how uneducated the majority of the population was. Looking at today, we have the news at our fingertips. We have social media. We have literally everything. We have every resource for every person who can vote in this country to be informed. But with a system like this, it takes away the incentive to even want to be informed.
I do understand the Electoral College's purpose of avoiding a demagogue. However, it does also deny many that representation that they feel that they do deserve based on the principles of this country. And with the media at our fingertips, while that does give inaccurate information and biased media, it also gives a lot of helpful information to those who are willing to go out and search for it. And that's important to note when it comes to voting in elections.
I also think it's really interesting to note how one of the problems with the Electoral College, or at least something I view as a problem, one of the reasons that it doesn't always follow the popular vote is because it's partially based on how many senators a state has, and senators are not based on population. And I understand that the goal was to ensure, again, that small states still have power and they aren't completely controlled by larger states. However, I think it's really interesting when you look at the actual data on the differences in population sizes for these states. I mean, according to the United States Census Bureau, in 1790, the smallest state was Delaware, with a total population of 59,094, and the largest state was Virginia, with a total population of 747,610. And that's just really interesting to me, because that means that at that time, the largest state was only about 12 and a half times bigger than the smallest state. But if you compare that to today's numbers, again from the United States Census Bureau, the largest state is California with a population of almost 40 million, and the smallest is Wyoming, which isn't even at 600,000. And in that situation, it's the largest state is almost 70 times the population of the smallest state. And that's just a huge difference, because these senators, they go to the national government and they have national power over the entire country. So that, I mean, as Mrs. Mize said as well, it just means that some people have significantly more political power simply based on where they live compared to others.
Yeah, and that is kind of the whole irony of the original goal about larger states, dominating smaller states and what they wanted for the country. Whereas now, smaller states are clearly overrepresented, and like Wyoming versus California, as we brought up, like each state has the same amount of power in the Senate, which, as part of the Great Compromise, it was called equal representation as opposed to the proportional representation in the House. But the irony is equal representation with the Senate creates unequal representation, because the sizes of each senator's constituency is the variance is enormous.
Yeah, and I think almost all of these topics, from like the closed primaries to the differences in Senate size and the Electoral College, can just be brought back to the simple idea of one person, one vote. And we all learned about this. This was established in the Supreme Court case Baker v. Carr. Basically, it was just the idea, or at least in that specific circumstance for like the state legislature there, that everyone should have a roughly equal say in who they elect. But the Electoral College and closed primaries and senators, they all sort of throw a wrench into this whole thing, because obviously people from small states, they have much less power they have much more power over the Senate per person than people from large states. And in closed primaries, if you are a member of a party that is not one that typically wins in your jurisdiction, then you have much less power over your elections than someone who is a member of one of those parties. And for the Electoral College, it's similar to the Senate. If you are in a small state, and especially a swing state, you have a lot more power over who actually gets elected than people in larger or more safe states.
It all boils down to the fact that in a time when our country was trying to make compromises to stay together, they decreased representation for some and increased them for others. And instead of changing that as we have grown as a nation and increased representation for all, we still have a lack of representation in our government, and that can be clearly seen in all of these factors we've discussed.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how far we have stretched some powers of the government, but we have not changed how we run elections in order for them to be more representative.
Yeah, and there have been some changes in that regard. I mean, we had the amendment that led to senators being directly elected.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
That obviously has allowed for more equal representation in that regard, at least, because then it used to be that senators weren't, and districts within state legislatures could be various sizes. So then obviously if you were from a small district, you would have a lot more power over who gets into your state legislature, and then a lot more power over who your senator is as well, by proxy. But we've changed that now, so that's at least some improvement, but there definitely is a lot more room for things to get better.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the reality of the situation is people don't feel like they're heard with our government, and that's why we need to improve that as a country and increase representation so that it isn't so clearly disproportionate.
Well, thank you for listening to Mopping the Floor, our conversation about representation. And just like our government, this podcast has been a mess.
Tune in to Mopping the Floor next week to hear our conversation on Puerto Rico.
See you soon!
Roll that outro music!